Consent and dissent in Nazi Germany. In the 1930s, the Nazi regime was able to acquire power through the law and legal system of the German country. The Conservative Party aligned with Hitler and believed that if they were able to place him in power that they would be able to overthrow the constitution and shift to a more traditional political system. However, that was not the case, because Hitler and the Nazis planned on overthrowing the government and thus created their own Nazi state. Once in power, the Nazis were able to create new laws and suspend all citizens' civil liberties. As such, without the German people's consent, they were able to create a novel fascist system that created its own rules and customs. This video aims to highlight that once the Nazis were in power, the German citizens were both tacit and assisted the Third Reich, while, in contrast, others fought against the regime, and any dissent was swiftly smashed by the Nazis. Nevertheless, most of the citizens helped the Gestapo through consent and by reporting fellow citizens to the Nazis. Popularity of the Nazi regime. Before the Nazis were able to subvert the constitution and place themselves in power, they had an elaborate propaganda machine that targeted the German people and outsiders. The German people desired a strong leader after World War I, and many believed that Hitler would protect them from a communist revolution. In truth, many of the citizens believed that the communists were violent and out of control. Thus, the Nazis would be a solution to smashing communist dissent. Moreover, even the British and Americans believed that the Nazis would be a great counterweight against the rise of communism. In response, the Nazis gave implicit permission to attack any communists, Jews, or people that did not fit within the regime's acceptance. Indeed, this tacit consent made Hitler one of the most popular politicians in the country. The Nazis promised order and believed that they could deliver it through violence and ridding the country of undesirables. Once Hitler and the Nazis were able to observe that the multitude agreed with their tactic of violence, they gave police duties to not protect the Jews or communists within the country. So, now the police had the power to abuse anyone that did not align with the Nazi administration. In response, many were terrified by the approach and fled the country. Prominent individuals, such as Albert Einstein and other intellectuals, fled the country because of the new threat. In 1933 the Reichstag building was set on fire by an anarchist, and Hitler used this as an opportunity to justify his attacks on malcontents. In response, Hitler was able to subvert the constitution with the assistance of President Hindenburg and could now arrest anyone. The new decree was used to arrest any dissenters and was labeled as protective custody. The Nazis were able to use these new protective actions as propaganda, claiming that they were protecting the state. Consent. With the suspension of civil liberties and the new threat of incarceration through protective custody, many German citizens were wary and careful that they did not break the new laws. The Nazis were able to create propaganda that promised order, but that only could be accomplished through terror on dissidents. Individuals that were gathered under the label of protective custody were placed in concentration camps. The first German concentration camp named Dachau was created on March 21, 1933. The claim was that individuals that were placed in the camp would be re-educated and would spend much of their time doing honest hard work for the state. The camp was widely publicized within Germany and across the world. Consequently, there was no legal binding of the camp, which maintained that the courts did not decide how long an individual would be incarcerated, but the regime would decide capriciously when an individual would be released. The concentration camp served as a way for the Nazis to receive free labor, rid the country of the unwanted, and to create more propaganda that would frighten and deter the German citizens from dissension. During the Berlin Olympics in 1936, the Nazis ordered the country to be cleaned of all anti-Jew graffiti and made the country look like a beacon of progress. The Nuremberg laws demanded that the Jews be separated, placed in ghettos, and banned any intermarriage between Aryans and Jews. Moreover, Hitler banned any interpersonal attacks on Jews and claimed that the state would handle the Jewish problem. This approach assisted the Germans during the Olympics, and the Nazi regime was praised by the USA president, other prominent Americans, and many others. With the Nazis and Hitler receiving praise from prominent figures, this affirmed the Nazis' position in the eyes of the German citizens and assisted with the consent of the regime. This was evident on the night of November 9, 1938, when the Nazis and many German citizens held a national rampage of violence against the Jewish people in the country. Sadly, 91 individuals were murdered, and more than 30,000 people were arrested and placed in the camps. There was no public backlash. The German citizenry consented most likely because of fear and propaganda. Gestapo. The Nazi regime created a secret police force that was responsible for collecting information on citizens and handling any resistance. The average citizen feared the Gestapo and believed that there were thousands of them lurking in every corner of the country. Heinrich Himmler was the director or main authority that operated the Gestapo and all other police forces within the country. Himmler held that the policeman ceased to be merely a cop, he was now a political soldier. He obtained far-reaching powers to defend the nation against enemies of the state, cleanse society of parasites, and contribute to the healthy development of the nation. By decree, police powers were extended in 1938 to arrest people identified as antisocial and send them to concentration camps without trials. Therefore, the Gestapo was merely a political soldier that held the task of enforcing Nazi loyalty, and anyone who rebelled would be arrested or murdered by the regime. The average citizen believed that there were many Gestapo agents that were constantly monitoring everyone within the country. However, that was far from the truth. Most of the information that the Gestapo received was from ordinary German citizens. In truth, the citizens were the actual surveillance of the state and constantly gave the authorities information of any perceived dissent. The average German citizen was afraid of the Nazi regime and would offer any information to the authorities that they deemed proper. This created a large amount of information that the Gestapo would have to sort through and decide who to persecute. Moreover, the Nazi terror was rarely arbitrary, unless one had the misfortune to belong to one of the regime's targeted groups: beggars, social misfits, communists or Jews. That means that 80% of all political crime was reported by ordinary citizens who turned the information over to the Gestapo. Without the assistance of normal German citizens, the Gestapo would not have the proper information to persecute any rebellion. Consequently, this created an information overload problem for the regime, and much of the information was false. Many of the German citizens were merely offering false information on their neighbors because of jealousy, vengeance, or just because of overzealousness. The Gestapo was aware of this and would arrest anyone that offered false information. Dissent. Many of the German citizens consented to the brute actions of the Nazi regime. However, there were many that revolted in countless ways. There were numerous assassination attempts on Hitler and other regime leaders. For example, Georg Elser attempted to kill Hitler with a bomb, and on another occasion, a group of army officers attempted to kill Hitler. All the attempts on Hitler's life were subverted and not one was successful. However, public dissent started to fester because at one time there were over 3 million Germans in concentration camps. Subsequently, Hitler and the Nazis started to lose popularity and support when the Allies started bombing German cities. This became evident when German soldiers started to abandon their military posts and the Nazis responded by charging them with treason. Many soldiers and German citizens were put to death because they rebelled against the regime. A group of university students created a Nazi rebellion known as the White Rose. The group was not particularly successful in their rebellion but became martyrs because of their anti-Nazi stance. Brother and sister Hans Scholl and Sophie Scholl and many other protesters rallied against the Nazis in Munich. They denounced the genocide of the Jews and the whole Nazi establishment. The group created anti-Nazi flyers and painted anti-Nazi slogans on buildings. The group's actions were noticed by the authorities and the brother and sister were imprisoned and sentenced to death. The brother and sister were executed by the guillotine. Hans' last words were freedom for all. The German citizens lost their civil liberties under the Nazi regime and were forced to comply with a one-party state. Most of the citizens were afraid of the Nazis and would offer information to the Gestapo if they perceived that any other citizens were in rebellion. Thus, the masses consented to the regime in some fashion. However, there were other individuals that rebelled against the regime through assassination attempts and activism.